The earth turned inside out. A high explosive shell tore into the loam 30 feet off the left flank, slamming a ton of mud onto the scalding armor. A gray mass of infantry flickered through the narrow slit of the periscope. The remnants of the forward screen were retreating through the smoke, ditching their heavy gear. The summer of 1944 smelled of scorched metal, cordite, and torn flesh. Static hissed through the headsets. A distorted, panicked voice from the outpost radio broke through the crackle. The position had been overrun. A German armored wedge was barreling toward the division's lines at full tilt. The heavy machines were closing the distance without slowing down. 50 tons of Krupp steel for every enemy tank. The armored line methodically crushed trenches and machine gun nests. Maneuvering in the rear guard of the retreat, miraculously avoiding direct hits, was a lone T-34 medium tank. Its diesel engines screamed at redline RPMs. Shrapnel lashed the turret armor, carving deep furrows. An artillery barrage blanketed square after square. Shells landed in a staggered pattern, cutting off the lines of retreat. Inside the steel box, the air was unbreathable. The stench of diesel, burnt oil, and sour sweat stung the nostrils. A young lieutenant, fresh out of the academy, gripped the ring of the commander's cupola with white-knuckled fingers. His face was gray, caked in soot, his eyes glazed. The textbook maneuvers for mobile combat had burned up along with the first line of defense. Fear choked his throat. His high-pitched, cracking scream erupted over the intercom. "Driver, stop! Pivot! Head on! Load armor piercing!" The order meant certain death. A meeting engagement against heavy armor in the open was textbook suicide. 100 millimeters of frontal armor on the German heavies against the 45 millimeters of the Soviet machine. Zero chance. A second's delay guaranteed a penetration and an ammo rack detonation. The enemy gun barrel on the horizon bucked. A crimson-yellow muzzle flash tore through the smoke. Sarek, the driver, didn't answer. His hands, locked onto the stiff control levers, worked faster than his mind. A step survival instinct took over. His right hand yanked the clutch lever back. His left foot slammed the throttle into the steel floor. The V12 diesel roared, belching a cloud of blue-gray smoke. 32 tons of Soviet metal lurched violently to the right, its wide tracks biting into the soft earth. An armor-piercing shell whistled through the air, exactly where the turret had been a split second before. A monstrous shockwave rocked the hull. Ears rang. Metal shavings showered down the collar of Sarek's coveralls. "Disregard that!" the lieutenant rasped, his voice breaking. "Court-martial! Follow the order!" "Shut it, Commander," Sarek barked over the deafening roar of the diesel. "Watch the ground! Head on, we're dead!" The tank dipped into a shallow shell crater. The engine roared louder. The machine snarled as it crested the ridge and plunged down again, snapping young trees. The T-34's low ground pressure allowed it to traverse the viscous, blast-churned mud where the German tanks risked bogging down for good. They had to exploit this immediately. Speed was life. An erratic maneuver was their only chance to survive this onslaught. In Sarek's vision block, the world narrowed to a sliver of scarred field. The earth trembled. A harsh vibration pulsed through the thin soles of his boots, echoing as pain in his spine. The engine wailed at the edge of its thermal limit. Heavy clumps of grass and topsoil flew from the track grousers, caking the vision slits. Another shell detonated to the right with a deafening crack. Hot shrapnel peppered the hull's armor plate like buckshot. The tank swerved. Sarek threw the machine into a hard zigzag, breaking his line of movement. Moving in a straight line under aimed fire was an execution. He knew the enemy's habits. The turret of a heavy German tank turned too slowly. He had to throw off their aim, Get off the line of fire. Close the distance in bursts. A heavy, rhythmic clanking grew louder from behind. The Germans were advancing in a steady march. Their long barrels pointed dead ahead, picking targets. The lieutenant in the turret frantically spun the periscope, swallowing acrid cordite smoke. "They're coming! 5 tanks! Dead ahead!" His voice spiraled into hysteria. The gunner remained silent, his forehead pressed hard against the rubber brow pad of the sight. The loader stood frozen, a 35-pound armor-piercing round in his hands, balancing on the swaying floor, trying to keep his footing with every jolt of the hull. Sarek didn't look back. He read the terrain ahead. Every gully, every fold in the land was etched into his brain. The open steppe doesn't forgive mistakes. This wasn't the steppe, but there were hills and deep ravines. Ahead, through the smoke, loomed a gentle slope thick with brush. A reverse slope. Perfect cover to go hull down. Another panicked scream in the headsets. "Stop! Fire from a short halt!" Sarek cursed under his breath. Stopping now meant a coffin for 4. The enemy gunner had already found his lead. The distance was closing too fast. A sharp throttle cut, left lever back to the stop. Traction vanished. The left track locked dead. The right track roared, spinning the heavy machine in place, kicking up a high fountain of sticky mud. The tank snapped 90 degrees, tucking its flank behind the smoking hulk of a knocked-out self-propelled gun. A second later, an 88mm armor-piercing shell slammed into the dead metal with a sickening shriek, gutting the casemate. Shrapnel sprayed in a white-hot fan, drumming loudly against the T-34's rear. Sarek kicked the stiff clutch, grinding the gear into place. The machine pitched forward heavily and lunged toward the safety of the ravine. But the engine's rhythm suddenly faltered. The motor choked. The RPMs began to plummet. The sharp smell of burning insulation hit his nose. The coolant temperature needle crawled inexorably into the red zone. And behind them, with a deafening clatter of wide tracks, the angular gray bulk of the lead enemy tank was already crawling onto the crest of the hill. The long gun began to lower slowly, catching the slowing Soviet machine in its crosshairs. The tachometer needle flickered and dropped. The engine wheezed, belching thick blue smoke directly into the fighting compartment through the narrow slits of the firewall. The cramped space instantly smelled of burnt rubber, scorching cast iron, and churned raw earth. The coolant temperature surged past 100 degrees. The motor was dying. Sarek slammed the heavy main clutch pedal, knocking the gear out with a crunch. His left hand yanked the manual fuel primer. 1, 2, 3. His back muscles seized in an icy cramp from the awkward position. The steel lever bit into his calloused palm. His right foot mashed the throttle into the floor until it hit the metal stop. The V12 diesel coughed, choked on fuel, and suddenly roared, hitting max RPMs. The tank lurched forward, slipping out of the line of sight a split second before a heavy enemy AP shell ripped into the loam behind the rear hull. A monstrous shockwave hurled 32 tons of Soviet metal toward the ravine. Sarek didn't let up on the speed. He drove the machine straight into the thick brush on the reverse slope of the hill. The tracks snapped the thick trunks of young oaks with a sickening crunch. Sharp branches shrieked against the frontal armor, stripping green paint down to bare metal. Sticky mud erupted in heavy fountains from under the wide tracks, settling in clumps on the scalding engine grills. The tank charged into a deep wash carved by spring rains, burying its sharp nose deep into the soft earth. The hull was pitched at nearly 30 degrees. The turret sat level with the edge of the ravine. Sarek had pulled off an aggressive, dirty bit of concealment under extreme time pressure. The machine's hull was completely hidden in the folds of the terrain. The firing sector looked directly into the flank of the advancing wedge. The turret traverse speed of the German heavies was only 8 degrees per second, and Sarek turned the ravine into a perfect death trap, weaponizing the enemy's sluggishness against them. Inside the cramped fighting compartment, it was a suffocating hell. The temperature climbed past 120 degrees. Acrid cordite smoke mercilessly stung inflamed eyes. The tiny fan on the turret roof helplessly swirled the scorching air, mixed with choking diesel fumes and the heavy stench of unwashed bodies. The young lieutenant's shoulders slammed against the massive breech of the gun as he gasped for air with an open mouth. His pale face was covered in gray patches of grime and sticky sweat. The gunner, a cadet only yesterday, gripped the traverse and elevation wheels with a death grip. His fingers trembled so violently that the steel handles rattled. He was mumbling incoherently, staring into the rubber brow pad of the telescopic sight with blind eyes, dilated by uncontrollable terror. Panic is more contagious than typhus. It paralyzes muscles, kills instincts, and burns up the oxygen in the cabin faster than an open flame. Sarek let go of the controls. He spun around in his narrow seat, kicked back the stiff backrest, and lunged back into the gloom of the turret. His heavy hand, in a coarse, oil-stained glove, slapped the gunner across the shoulder. The blow was short, heavy, and sobering. The boy jerked, his helmeted head hitting the steel side with a thud, and looked wildly at the driver. "Breathe," Sarek rasped. "Through your nose. Shut your trap. Look through the sight." The commander tried to scream something hysterically, but Sarek cut him off without raising his voice, yet his words sliced through the hum of the idling engine. "Load armor piercing. Turret to 11 o'clock. Stay quiet. Wait for my word." The clang of the sliding wedge breech was deafeningly loud. The 35-pound shell slid into the breech with a rasp. The mechanism snapped shut, locking the chamber tight. The tank went still. Only a faint, continuous tremor ran through the armored hull. The diesel was idling smoothly, ready to hurl the multi-ton mass forward at any second. Sarek closed his eyes for a single moment. He listened to the metal. His father, an old steppe horse herder, had taught him, "Don't break a wild beast with force. Feel its rhythm. Become part of it." Iron isn't a horse, but the law is the same. The Soviet machine was now a compressed steel spring, a living, breathing predator crouched in the tall grass before a lethal pounce. Sarek felt the vibration of every cylinder, the extreme tension of the taut track belts ready to bite into the earth. He merged with the tank, dissolving into the smell of overheated iron. In this cramped metal womb, there was no more room for animal fear. Only the dry, ruthless mechanics of the coming fight remained. The earth began to vibrate. At first it was faint, barely noticeable, a slight, unpleasant tremor in the thin soles of their boots. Then the vibration intensified rapidly, turning into a low, visceral rumble that chilled them to the bone. Hundreds of tons of Krupp steel were approaching. Enemy tracks mercilessly ground the dry earth into fine dust. The clatter of wide grousers grew louder with every passing second. The Germans advanced in a tight, deployed line, absolutely confident in their frontal invulnerability. They weren't looking for ambushes in minor gullies. They were simply crushing everything with mass. Gray, boxy silhouettes loomed in the commander's narrow periscope. The turrets of the heavy tanks swayed in motion, keeping time with the uneven terrain. Long gun barrels searched the smoky horizon blindly. "They're coming," the gunner whispered with parched lips. His hands no longer shook. His white-knuckled fingers gripped the triggers. Fear was gone. All that remained was the cold, sticky sweat stinging his eyes and the black crosshairs of the sight into which the angular flank of the lead machine was inexorably crawling. The tank had finally merged with the terrain. The ambush had become a wire pulled to the breaking point. Seconds stretched into long, agonizing hours. The clatter of approaching tracks filled every inch of the fighting compartment, squeezing the last of the oxygen from their lungs. The earth shook. The distance melted away. 800 meters, 700. Dust from the enemy tracks was already settling on the T-34's armor. The Germans were moving in the open, exposing their flanks for a perfect direct shot. But it was too early to strike. Any premature hit would just scratch the thick armor and give away their position. They had to let them get close, draw them into the guaranteed penetration zone. Sarek gripped the levers until his knuckles cracked. A ringing, sweaty silence hung in the cabin, broken only by the monstrous, encroaching roar from outside. The Predator waited for its one and only chance. The first gray hulk tumbled over the brush-covered ridge. The massive frontal armor crested the earthen berm, snapping the trunks of fallen pines with a dry crack. A second machine crawled out behind it, then a third. The German armored wedge lumbered into the depression. The clatter of dozens of wide track links turned into a solid, monolithic wall of sound. This low rumble physically pressed against their eardrums, driving all thoughts from their heads. The grind of metal on stone drowned out even the steady thrum of the idling Soviet diesel. The enemy moved in a dense, confident march. The long barrels of their heavy guns pointed straight ahead. The Germans rolled out onto the plain, preparing to methodically finish off the retreating Soviet infantry. None of them looked toward the overgrown ravine on the reverse slope of the hill. The crews believed in the impenetrable thickness of their steel and their overwhelming firepower. The heavy tread of Krupp armor shook the loam. Every vibration of the frozen earth traveled through the hidden machine's suspension arms, directly into the tensed spines of the crew. Inside the cramped, red-hot steel box, time froze like thick resin. The air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The suffocating smell of spilled diesel was permanently fused with acrid sweat and gun grease. The young lieutenant held his mouth wide open, catching the remnants of stale oxygen in ragged gulps. His hand, in a filthy glove, frantically squeezed the intercom's PTT button. Panic began to eat at his mind again. Animal instinct demanded immediate action. Run or fire at the enemy, now. "Fire!" the commander wheezed, his bloodshot eyes locked onto the overwhelming mass of gray metal in the narrow vision slit. "Open fire!" Sarek, without looking back, grabbed the lieutenant's knee with an iron grip. The driver's hard fingers squeezed like a steel vise, causing sharp pain. This blunt physical shock instantly sobered the commander, knocking the hysteria out of his boiling head. "Shut it," Sarek muttered through his teeth. "Shut up and wait. When they show their flanks, we strike." The crew's discipline balanced on the very edge of a nervous breakdown. The gunner's damp forehead was glued to the rubber brow pad of the telescopic sight. In the black crosshairs, the angular turret of the lead heavy tank swayed gently. The German commander was sticking out chest-high from his cupola, calmly scanning the horizon with binoculars. The distance closed with ruthless inevitability. 500 meters. The massive machines were moving too close together. The risk of missing was minimal, but the thick frontal armor would easily shrug off any hit. Firing now was absolutely out of the question. Only the flank. Only for a guaranteed kill. 400 meters. The enemy tracks kicked up heavy slabs of rich, black soil. The roar of the mighty engines merged into a low-frequency growl that echoed as a dull pain in their chests. A large bead of salty sweat rolled off the gunner's forehead, painfully stinging his right eye. He blinked, not daring to move his cramped hand from the stiff traverse wheel. The leather upholstery of the seat creaked. The loader stood frozen by the breech, his bare hands gripping the cold metal of the 35-pound AP shell. His breathing became ragged, short, and raspy. Every second of forced waiting burned through their nerves. Sarek listened to the cadence of the enemy engines. He physically felt the multi-ton hulks breaking the geometry of the field, their monstrous mass pressing down the earth. The armor penetration of the Soviet 85mm gun guaranteed a kill only at point-blank range or at a perfect angle of impact. He needed a shot at a dead-on right angle into the thin armor plate just above the road wheels. 300 meters. Suddenly, the lead machine lurched and slowed down sharply. The wide tracks ground to a halt, kicking up a cloud of dust. The entire armored wedge stopped. The heavy tank's turret twitched. The electric traverse motor gave a high-pitched whine, and the long barrel, with its massive muzzle brake, began to turn slowly, inexorably to the right, straight toward the overgrown ravine where the ambush lay hidden. A dead, ringing silence hung in the cabin of the Soviet machine. The gunner's heart skipped a beat. If the German commander spotted an unnatural break in the bushes or a stray glint from an optic through his binoculars, it was instant death. 88 millimeters of Krupp steel would punch right through the Soviet armor and the crew's flesh. Sarek instinctively hunched his shoulders. His fingers turned white on the control levers. If the enemy fired first, they wouldn't have time to get away. The enemy turret continued to crawl. The black maw of the massive gun was looking right at them. 3 long seconds of absolute, paralyzing terror. Cold, sticky sweat ran down the lieutenant's grimy neck. The enemy gun barrel jerked up, paused for a moment, and then crawled back to the left, returning to its original axis of march. The German commander was just scanning his sector. The machines clattered their tracks again and lunged forward, rapidly regaining their lost speed. They began a slight turn following the terrain, exposing their vulnerable gray flanks to the strike. The deadly trap snapped shut. 200 meters. 150. A wall of steel filled the entire view of the telescopic sight. The gunner could see every rivet on the side skirts. A perfect angle. The armored flanks stood at exactly 90 degrees to the tank hidden in the ravine. He couldn't wait any longer. The slightest shift in the enemy's hull, and the angle would change, causing the shell to whistle off in a useless ricochet. "Target the lead! Under the turret!" the lieutenant rasped. His throat seized in a hard spasm. His voice broke into a whistle. "Fire!" The gunner mashed the firing pedal with superhuman strength. The firing pin struck the primer. The fighting compartment exploded with a primal, deafening roar. 85 millimeters of fury erupted from the barrel with a piercing shriek. Violent recoil slammed into the hull. The multi-ton machine recoiled sharply, its road wheels digging hard into the loose floor of the ravine. The massive steel breech of the gun slammed back with a clang, spitting out the spent casing. Red-hot brass crashed onto the metal floor, instantly filling the cramped space with acrid, gray-yellow cordite gas. The smoke immediately made their eyes water and stole their breath. The loader instinctively ducked the heavy recoil of the breech, immediately snarling as he grabbed a fresh, armor-piercing shell. The tungsten core crossed the distance in a fraction of a second. It struck exactly under the turret of the lead German heavy. Kinetic energy crushed the German steel, punching through the flank with a dull, sickening crunch of rending metal. The slug pierced the armor and entered the enemy's fighting compartment, obliterating the mechanisms in its path. A moment later, the ammo rack detonated. A monstrous internal explosion tore the lead machine apart. The massive, boxy turret, weighing several tons, was ripped from its ring with a horrific screech and tossed into the air on a high fountain of blinding flame. A powerful shockwave slammed into the neighboring tanks, blowing stowage boxes and infantry off their armor. Scattered chunks of white-hot metal rained down heavily. The German line broke in a single second. The perfect tactical order dissolved into panicked chaos. The vehicle following the leaders slammed on its brakes, tracks screeching as it tried to avoid the burning wreck. The third tank swerved, exposing its vulnerable rear. The stunning blow to the flank completely paralyzed the enemy. They didn't understand exactly where death had come from. The burning torch lit up the hollow. "Armor piercing!" the loader screamed, slamming a new shell into the breech. The metallic thud drowned out the ringing in their ears. The block snapped shut. "Positions blown!" Sarek roared over the roar of the flames outside. "We're moving! Hang on! I'm flooring it!" The driver pulled the right lever back with all his might and mashed the gas pedal into the floor. The diesel roared under the strain. The tank leaped out of the ravine, leaving a thick cloud of blue smoke behind. The game of hide and seek was over. The deadly carousel was beginning at breakneck speeds. The ambush was blown. The burning hulk of the lead German machine lit the gloom of the hollow with a bright orange glare. The explosion had stripped their cover. The enemy instantly calculated the direction of the strike. The long barrels of the surviving heavy tanks jerked in unison. Electric drives wailed. The enemy's boxy turrets crawled toward the hill with a grind. They were zeroing in on the thick exhaust smoke of the Soviet diesel. 88 millimeters of Krupp steel were hunting for a target. The distance had closed to the limit. A shell would cover that ground in a heartbeat. Sarek mashed the throttle until it hit the metal stop. The 12-cylinder motor choked on fuel and roared deafeningly. The driver yanked the left lever back, locking the track. 32 tons of Soviet armor spun hard in place, snapping young oaks. The tank leaped from its cover. Exactly 1 moment later, an armor-piercing slug ripped into the loam at the bottom of the ravine. A monstrous shockwave slammed into the rear of the retreating machine. Tons of earth flew into the air. Shrapnel shrieked against the armor plate, shearing off rivets. The threat of destruction had turned into a direct pursuit. An erratic rhythm of maneuvering began. Staying on a single trajectory meant becoming a coffin for 4. Sarek drove the machine blind, navigating by the muzzle flashes. Right lever, left lever, clutch, brake. The machine swerved sharply between trees, nearly throwing its tracks on the tight turns. The acrid smell of burning friction plates hung in the cramped cabin. Smoke clouded the vision slits. The driver worked on raw instinct. The stiff levers battered his arms. The skin on his palms split from the superhuman strain. Blood mixed with grease, slicking the steel handles. He felt no pain, only the heavy kickback of the metal and the vibration of the earth. To the right, the angular bulk of an enemy heavy lurched from behind a dense wall of brush. The German gunner took a short lead. A heavy shell shrieked over the T-34's turret with a sickening howl. The air thickened from the kinetic shock. The projectile sheared through the thick crowns of the pines and a rain of wooden splinters showered the red-hot engine deck. Sarek stomped on the brakes with both feet. The multi-ton tank nosedived, its tracks biting into the black earth with a screech. Emergency stop. Exactly 3 seconds, not a moment more. The enemy was already cranking the flywheels, bringing the barrel back onto the line of sight. "Target front!" The commander's cracked voice broke through the static of the intercom. "On the way!" the gunner exhaled. The 85mm cannon roared, spitting a long tongue of flame. Monstrous recoil rocked the fighting compartment. The heavy breech slammed back with a clang, ejecting a smoking brass casing. A miss. The blunt-nosed shell struck a shower of white sparks off the German's sloped glacis plate and ricocheted away with a foul screech. Steel failed to bite steel. "Ricochet! AP!" the loader screamed. He snatched a 35-pound shell and rammed it into the hot chamber in one motion. The breech block snapped shut with a dry, metallic clack. Yellow propellant gas scorched their lungs. Sarek didn't wait for the enemy gun to settle. The 3 seconds were up. The German turret had only just begun lowering its barrel for the kill. The driver yanked the levers and dumped the clutch. The tank lunged forward with a roar, plunging into the thick undergrowth. The enemy shell struck empty space, obliterating a stump behind them. The carousel of death was picking up speed. The Soviet machine played its only ace, mobility. Its low ground pressure allowed the T-34 to glide over the mud where the heavy German monsters bogged down to their hubs. Sarek drove the tank in a wide arc, moving into the enemy's blind spot. The diesel roared at the limit of its thermal range. The needles on the dashboard hammered against the red line. The cramped interior had turned into a searing oven. The smell of burnt rubber scorched their throats. Every breath was a rasping struggle. A thick layer of mud plastered the periscopes. Another burst of speed. A jolt to the left. Ducking behind the smoking hulk of a knocked-out APC. Braking. A sharp turret traverse. The young crew was losing its human form. The men had become appendages of a weapons system. Panic had burned away completely. All that remained was the cold, vicious mechanics of survival. The lieutenant rasped out coordinates, his face bloodied and battered against the sight. The gunner caught gray silhouettes in the trembling crosshairs. The loader worked like a wound-up machine, hurling 30-pound slugs into the red-hot metal of the breech. His blistered hands felt no weight. "Stop!" 2 seconds. The engine growled at idle. "Flank! Fire!" Shot. A blinding flash. The dull, terrifying thud of a penetration. A pillar of thick black smoke erupted from the second enemy machine's engine compartment. The enemy lurched and ground to a halt. Severed fuel lines ignited. But the carousel didn't stop. 3 more heavy tanks abruptly shifted tactics. They stopped crawling forward. The enemy machines began fanning out, attempting to catch the elusive Soviet tank in a pincer. The clatter of their tracks echoed from all sides. The space for a life-saving maneuver was shrinking fast. The forest was thinning. Open steppe lay ahead. Breaking into the open meant becoming a perfect target for crossfire. Sarek spat bitter saliva. He wiped bloody sweat from his forehead with a grimy sleeve. His eyes narrowed. He yanked both levers back, floorboarding the pedals. The tank spun violently in place, crushing surviving trees, and charged straight toward the advancing wall of steel, ducking under the safe angle of fire into the very thick of the enemy formation. The tracks tore up the earth. The diesel wailed in one endless note. The distance closed to point-blank range. The distance closed to point-blank. The T-34 flew into the center of the enemy formation at full tilt. The massive, angular bulks of the German heavies loomed on all sides, blocking the horizon with gray armor plate. The space instantly turned into a roaring, lethal centrifuge of thick dust, acrid yellow cordite smoke, and clods of rich black soil flying in every direction. The Soviet machines circled rapidly between the steel giants. The enemy turrets tried to track the nimble target with a deafening metallic screech. The electric drives of the German traverse mechanisms wailed piteously under the extreme load. But their turret traverse speed was catastrophically insufficient. The enemy physically couldn't keep up with the jagged, aggressive rhythm of the Soviet maneuver. Heavy guns fired at nothing, plowing the earth where the tank's rear had been a second before. Inside the searing, cramped cabin, the humans had vanished. Only flawless mechanisms of flesh, blood, and taut nerves remained. The paralyzing animal fear had burned out in the first minutes of contact. The blind panic of yesterday's cadets had transformed into the dead, absolute focus of professionals. The young lieutenant stopped screaming and frantic movement. His commands became short, dry verbal strikes cutting through the intercom static. The gunner was fused to the eyepiece of the telescopic sight. The rubber brow pad had bloodied his eyebrow from the constant jarring, but he ignored the red droplets blurring his vision. Enemy flanks and rear plates flickered in the narrow black crosshairs for fractions of a second. That was enough. Fingers squeezed the heavy triggers on raw combat instinct. The loader had become a relentless human piston. Massive 16-kilogram armor-piercing slugs slammed into the glowing chamber of the gun time and again. The clang of the heavy wedge breech block beat out the merciless rhythm of this deadly slalom. Spent brass casings clattered onto the metal floor of the fighting compartment. They were glowing red-hot, melting the rubber soles of their boots and filling the cabin with unbearable heat and suffocating gas. The crew's synchronized work reached an absolute predatory automatism. No one thought about death or survival anymore. They were simply doing a dirty, grueling job at the very edge of human physical limits. The scorched air burned their lungs like an open flame with every gasping breath. Sarek was physically spent. Breath escaped his constricted throat with a raspy, strained whistle. His tanker coveralls were soaked through with sticky sweat and clung to his back. The unsynchronized gearbox demanded monstrous effort for every shift. The stiff steel control levers ground his palms into a bloody mess. The thick, calloused skin on his hands had split in several places from the constant friction. Hot blood slicked the metal handles, forcing him to grip them with even greater, inhuman strength that cramped his forearms. His right leg had gone completely numb from the constant, brutal stomping on the stiff throttle pedal. But the driver had long since stopped feeling the pain. The ancient instinct of a steppe hunter had taken full control of his body. Sarek didn't just see the chaotic battlefield through the narrow vision slit. He felt it with every cell of his skin. He caught the slightest changes in the low roar of the enemy's 12-cylinder engines through the thunder of his own diesel. He felt in his marrow exactly where the enemy's multi-ton long barrel was turning through the thick, impenetrable veil of cordite smoke. Directly ahead, the massive, sloped silhouette of a panther suddenly surged out of a dust cloud. 75 millimeters of long-barreled death stared directly at the charging Soviet tank. The German gunner had managed to catch the target in his optics. Range, less than 50 meters. There was no time to swerve. The enemy's massive muzzle brake twitched almost imperceptibly before the shot. Sarek realized it a millisecond before the blinding flash. The lethal threat demanded an immediate kinetic solution. With a desperate roar, the driver slammed both feet onto the main brake pedals. Simultaneously, he yanked both steering clutches back to the stop, throwing his entire body weight into the pull. 32 tons of hurtling metal bit into the earth with steel tracks, creating a monstrous, deafening screech. The rear road wheels hammered off the ground. The tank nosedived with such destructive force that the crew was nearly smeared against the internal steel bulkheads. An emergency hard stop on the very brink of flipping the machine. The compressed air right in front of the T-34's nose tore apart with a foul, piercing shriek. The Panther's AP shell passed inches from the sloped glacis plate. The kinetic shock blew the spare track links off the armor and sheared away the metal headlight. A resilient shockwave lashed into the vision slit, momentarily blinding the driver with kicked-up dust. The enemy had missed. The Soviet tank hadn't even dropped its heavy rear back to the ground yet. The suspension's oscillation hadn't finished its cycle. "Under the turret! Fire!" the lieutenant spat, along with blood from a bitten lip. The gunner mashed the trigger. The 85mm barked, spitting a long tongue of blinding flame. A shot at point-blank range required no long, careful aiming. The heavy AP shell struck exactly under the Panther's turret, right into the thin vertical armor belt above the track shelf. The kinetic impact shattered the Krupp steel. A monstrous explosion inside the enemy machine tore the heavy commander's hatches out by the roots. A bright fountain of sparks, fire, and thick black smoke erupted from every seam of the German tank. The second heavy machine turned into a blazing steel coffin. The high-stakes evasion had paid off. The battle was being won by torn calluses and pure reflex. But the clatter of foreign tracks behind them didn't stop. The death dance continued. The German armored wedge broke. The iron logic of Krupp steel suffered a catastrophic failure under the blows of maneuver tactics. 3 heavy combat machines had turned into blazing funeral pyres at the bottom of the cratered hollow. Thick, oily black smoke rose toward the gray sky, completely blotting out the horizon. From the ruptured hull of the first knocked-out machine, a new fountain of blinding flame erupted with a dull, sickening pop. The remaining ammunition cooked off. The heavy, angular turret, sheared from its ring by monstrous internal pressure, lay askew a dozen meters from the smoking wreck. Its long barrel and massive muzzle brake now stared uselessly into the churned-up earth. Inside the steel coffins, wiring melted with a foul hiss, and glass vision blocks shattered from the unbearable heat. Burning diesel spread across the track-torn clay, turning the battlefield into a scorched purgatory. The smell of burnt metal was permanently fused with acrid cordite gas and the melted rubber of the road wheel tires. The remnants of the enemy's elite tank company wavered. An invisible, rapid foe had crushed their tactical confidence. The surviving German crews didn't understand what had happened. Through the dense wall of dust and smoke, only mud and showers of sparks from ricochets flew into their optical sights. They were absolutely certain they had blundered into a well-prepared, massive fire ambush. By their calculations, dozens of barrels had pinned them in this cursed forest. Panic, cold and clammy, pierced even the thickest armor. The massive gray machines, firing blindly in all directions, began to hastily reverse. Their heavy, wide tracks ground down fallen trees with a screech as they yielded the conquered ground. 88mm shells tore through the pine crowns at random, leaving thick, whitish trails in the air. The Germans opened the distance, breaking formation, saving their surviving armor from invisible ghosts. Out of a thick cloud of blue exhaust, a Soviet T-34-85 crawled onto the forest edge. Its 12-cylinder diesel engine
labored with a heavy, strained rasp. One cylinder had clearly failed. Boiling coolant spat from a ruptured pipe onto the red-hot engine deck, instantly evaporating into thick white steam. The machine wallowed heavily over deep craters, leaving jagged ruts in the black soil. The tank resembled a wounded but lethal predator. Deep gouges, gleaming with fresh metal from shrapnel and direct hits from heavy machine guns, scarred its sloped frontal armor. The left fender had been torn away. The right side metal toolbox had been sheared off by the kinetic blow of a slug. The entire turret was coated in a thick layer of black soot, sticky mud, and wood splinters. But there wasn't a single through penetration on the hull. 32 tons of Soviet steel had passed this monstrous test of survival, thanks to continuous movement. At the bottom of the hollow, the clumsy, dead steel coffins of the enemy smoldered. Their excessive armor thickness had become their own death trap. And on the crest of the hill, the soot-covered Victor pulsed with heat. A living, fire-breathing machine. A thin, transparent wisp of smoke still curled from the 85mm bore. The gun's metal was so hot, it scorched the air around it. The tension of battle didn't fade for a second. Death still hung in the air, ready to strike. The Soviet tank's turret turned slowly, with an ominous groan of the electric drive, following the retreating silhouettes of the enemy. The black crosshairs of the telescopic sight were glued to the rear armor plate of the trailing heavyweight.
Inside the fighting compartment, a ringing, muffled silence reigned, broken only by the labored coughing of the damaged engine. The crew wasn't celebrating. The young commander squeezed the intercom trigger, his bloodshot eyes fixed on the periscope. The gunner didn't pull his bloodied face from the rubber brow pad. The loader froze, with another 30-pound AP slug in his blackened hands. The gun's breech remained open. Sarek gripped the control levers with a death grip. His muscles had turned to stone. The retreating Germans could realize their fatal mistake at any moment. If even one enemy commander realized they had been decimated by a single medium tank, they would stop. They would traverse their turrets, and then the AP slugs would finish what they started. The oil temperature needle lay in the red zone. At any second, the overheated diesel could seize, turning the machine into a stationary target. Sarek feathered the clutch pedal, keeping the RPMs on the verge of stalling. "Range 1,000 meters, the gunner reported dryly, swallowing salty blood from a split lip. "They're moving behind the hill." "Hold the sight," the commander exhaled. They waited. The barrels were white-hot. Any stray glance from an enemy gunner could drag them back into the roaring hell of close-quarters combat. The motor coughed one last time, spitting a blue cloud of exhaust. Sarek killed the fuel supply with a hard palm strike. The 12-cylinder heart of the Soviet machine stopped. The vibration that had replaced the crew's pulse for the last few hours, thrumming through their bodies from heels to neck vertebrae, abruptly ceased. The multi-ton steel box went still. Silence fell. It brought no expected relief. This ringing, muffled, thick silence hit their ears harder than a direct hit from an AP shell. Eardrums, deafened by the continuous guttural roar of the diesel at max RPMs, the screech of stones ground by tracks, and the monstrous thunder of their own 85mm gun, now ruptured from a piercing high-frequency whistle. The spatial shell shock pressed against their skulls. The tank stood motionless on the edge of the crater-scarred clearing. The physiological backlash hit their nervous systems instantly. The adrenaline that had held their bodies in a state of extreme, predatory muscular tension began to rapidly recede. It left behind a scorched chemical void. The animal reflex that had forced men to act faster than a flying shell switched off.
In its place came ruthless physiology. The young lieutenant yanked at the stiff fastener of his tanker helmet with trembling, completely disobedient fingers. The leather helmet fell onto the metal floor, littered with spent brass casings, with a dull thud. The commander convulsively gulped the stale, overheated air of the cabin. His face, coated in a thick layer of black cordite soot, greasy grime and sweat, suddenly took on an earthy gray, deathly hue. His stomach twisted in a violent, painful spasm. The lieutenant barely managed to turn away from the massive breach. He vomited bile directly onto the red-hot pile of empty casings. Retching fits shook the young officer's thin back again and again. His body was physically rejecting the chthonic horror it had endured. The acidic smell of vomit instantly mixed with the suffocating stench of spilled diesel, scorched electrical insulation, and burnt gun grease. No one said a word. No one looked away. In this cramped steel womb reeking of death, there was no room for regulation shame. This was a normal, brutal reaction of the human body to the extreme proximity of torn flesh and flying iron. The naive cadets of yesterday had ended there, at the bottom of the hollow. The burning hulks of the German heavies had forever scorched the illusions and youth out of them.
They had become men who knew the price of a split second. The gunner, slowly, as if moving through thick syrup, peeled his bloodied face from the rubber eyepiece of the telescopic sight. His inflamed eyelids twitched. The loader slumped heavily onto the ribbed floor of the tank, his arms hanging limply at his sides. His fingers, covered in blisters from brutal burns against the red-hot metal of the breech, shook uncontrollably. A leaden exhaustion settled on their shoulders, pressing the men to the floor like an invisible multi-ton press. Every movement now came with monstrous difficulty, requiring a colossal effort of will. Outside, a suffocating smell of burning drifted in. The protective paint on the engine armor plate bubbled and began to smolder from the extreme overheating of the engine. Acrid white smoke drifted into the open commander's hatch. "We're burning," the loader rasped, not recognizing his own cracked voice. The words sounded like a dry sentence, but no panic arose. Combat-ingrained reflexes kicked in. The crew, overcoming the ache in their joints, tumbled out onto the armor. Their legs wouldn't hold, buckling treacherously on the uneven weld seams and armor plates. The tankers ripped canvas covers from the sides, furiously bunched them up, and silently, methodically beat out the smoldering flames from the red-hot metal. The machine's metal lived a life of its own. The cooling, thick armor made loud, sharp clicks, like snapping pistol shots. The thermal stress was receding. The tank clicked, cooled, smoked in blue wisps, but continued to live. Having finished with the fire, they sank onto the turret, exhausted. 3 pairs of eyes stared with deep, absolute, and silent respect at the open driver's hatch. From there, Sarek climbed out heavily, gripping the sharp edges of the frontal armor with hands ground to blood. His face had turned into a solid black crust of embedded dust and machine oil, where only his narrow eyes, inflamed from extreme tension, flickered feverishly. His broad chest heaved, drawing in air with a loud, ragged, whistling rasp. His tanker coveralls were soaked through with sweat and hung on his body like a heavy, dirty sack. Sarek scrambled onto the sloped armor plate and leaned his back heavily against the gun barrel. He raised his hands, resting them on his knees. The thick, hardened calluses of a hereditary steppe horseman had been torn down to raw, living meat. Blood had dried into dark, almost black crusts on his palms. These torn tendons, these bleeding wounds,
and the predatory intuition of a man of the steppe had just cleanly outplayed the perfect Krupp steel. Blind faith in enemy technology had shattered against the honed reflex of a Soviet driver. The lieutenant slowly wiped his lips with a grimy sleeve. The humiliating tremor in his knees subsided slightly. He squeezed back through the hatch and reached for the radio handset. The airwaves still hissed hostilely with static, but the panicked screams of the outpost were no longer heard. "1, this is 05, the lieutenant's voice sounded cracked, completely emotionless, like the dry metallic clack of a breech block. "Report follows. Grid 42. Ambush successful. Breakthrough halted. Confirming destruction of 3 enemy heavy armor units. Machines are burning." A loud crackle came from the speaker, followed by a long, disbelief-filled pause. On the other end of the HQ line, they physically couldn't believe what they were hearing. A single medium tank had stopped the breakthrough of a heavy-hitting wedge. 05, repeat, how many destroyed? 3 units. Burning. Out. The lieutenant released the button and tiredly closed his eyes. Outside, Sarek turned his grimy face to a faint breath of cool wind.
From the hollow, a thick, oily pillar of black smoke continued to rise relentlessly. The ringing silence grew denser. The mangled machine roared into the battalion positions, nearly crushing the parapet of the forward screen. The tortured metal screeched hideously. The torn left fender dragged along the ground, kicking up sparks from the stones. The sloped frontal armor was scarred with deep gouges from direct hits and heavy shrapnel. The infantry in the trenches scrambled away in fear from the soot-covered tank, which looked as if it had just clawed its way out of hell. The T-34 stopped by the camouflaged HQ bunker, nosediving sharply. The 12-cylinder diesel sputtered and died. The tankers tumbled out of the hatches, gripping the red-hot armor with scorched fingers. They moved awkwardly, like shell-shocked mannequins. Down into the bunker. The air here was heavy and stale, saturated with the sour smell of cheap tobacco smoke, damp earth, and unwashed bodies. A dim kerosene lamp caught the exhausted face of the young lieutenant in the gloom. He stood at attention before a table made of rough planks. His knees were still trembling treacherously. Beside him, Sarek breathed heavily. The driver leaned his shoulder hard against the log wall, leaving damp, bloody prints of his raw palms on the unplaned wood. 2 men sat at the table. The battalion commander, a heavy-set major with eyes bloodshot from exhaustion, and a special department captain in an impeccably clean tunic. The captain didn't look at the tankers. Instead, he stared through the detailed topographic map spread across the table with a steady, unblinking gaze. "Repeat your report, Lieutenant." The major's voice sounded dull, like iron hammer blows on wood. No emotion, just the cold facts. "Fire ambush in Sector 42, the lieutenant rasped, struggling to move his parched tongue. "Avoided a head-on engagement. Used the reverse slope for concealment. Let the enemy's armored wedge pass, then hit them square in the flank. I confirm 3 heavy tanks destroyed. The remaining enemy forces retreated in haste." The major's fist slammed onto the table with a deafening crash. An aluminum mug rattled, splashing murky tea over the documents. 3 heavies, with 1 medium tank. Have you lost your mind, Lieutenant? The major erupted, his voice rising to an aggressive shout. The veins in his neck bulged dangerously. "The outpost was pulverized. The whole company is in the dirt. And you claim you stopped an armored breakthrough single-handedly. This is panic, concussed hallucinations, or plain old cowardice. You abandoned your positions, leaving the infantry to be crushed under their treads." The special department captain slowly raised his eyes from the map. His gaze was ice cold, scanning right through the man. Deserting a combat line without orders means an immediate court-martial, Lieutenant, the counterintelligence officer said, quietly but clearly. Execution by firing squad. Do you understand the weight of your words? One short 85mm barrel against the frontal armor of a German wedge. The laws of ballistics completely rule out such a result. You are lying to my face. The lieutenant turned even paler. He opened his mouth to protest, but was cut off sharply. Sarek pushed himself off the wall with effort. The driver-mechanic took one short step forward. He didn't offer excuses. Instead, he silently thrust out his hands, mangled by the stiff control levers. The skin was torn away in strips. Deep wounds were black with machine grease, and thick, clotted blood covered ruptured calluses. Standard math doesn't account for the terrain, Captain, Sarek said hollowly. His voice sounded like the monotonous clank of a tank tread. The manual doesn't know exactly how slow a heavy German turret rotates in thick mud. They're blind on the flanks. We hit them point blank, in the side and under the turret ring. From a standstill and at full throttle. The mud saved us. Their own excess weight is what killed them. A heavy silence hung in the cramped bunker. The captain shifted his gaze from the mechanic's bloodied hands to his dead, calm face. There wasn't a drop of fear in the tanker's eyes. There was only the bottomless exhaustion of a man who had just gutted death with his bare hands. "Get the car," the officer barked at the major, rising from the table. "We're going to Sector 42. Now." The open-top American scout car roared to life, spraying mud from under its wide tires. The engine wailed under the strain. The officers jolted in their hard seats, gripping the handrails for dear life. The artillery bombardment of the sector hadn't ceased. The earth shuddered dully. Black geysers of dirt erupted to the left and right. Shrapnel hissed through the cold air overhead with a foul shriek. The Special Department officer didn't flinch. He looked only forward. The scout car slammed on its brakes at the edge of a deep ravine. The driver cut the engine. The officers stepped out and froze on the embankment. Their office-bound skepticism shattered instantly against the brutal reality of the trenches. At the bottom of the cratered ravine, 3 gargantuan steel pyres were smoldering. The mangled carcasses of the heavy machines had turned into shapeless heaps of torn, scorched metal. The acrid stench of burnt flesh and molten armor steel hit their nostrils, triggering a gag reflex. Stunned, the major pulled off his cap. He stepped forward, his boots sliding on the diesel-soaked earth. A cold inspection of the battlefield put everything in its place. The captain descended to the bottom of the ravine. He read the wide tread marks in the dirt like an open technical manual. Here were the furrows pressed into the loam, where the Soviet tank had sat in a dead ambush, its hull completely hidden behind the crest of the ridge. A perfect firing position. Not a single wasted movement. There, a scattering of hot brass casings. And there, the point of the first lethal blow. The officer walked up to the shredded hull of the lead tank. The 80mm side armor plate had been punched inward with monstrous force. The edges of the hole were melted and peeled outward from the colossal internal pressure of detonated shells. The hit was delivered at a precise 90-degree angle. Perfect geometric calculation. Further on, the tracks told the story of an impossible maneuver. Jagged trenches from narrow Soviet treads crisscrossed the ravine in unpredictable zigzags. The tank had darted between the enemy's heavy machines, braking hard and then lunging forward with lightning speed. Marks from emergency braking had stripped the sod down to the bedrock. Nearby, black craters marked where German shells had missed. The enemy physically couldn't traverse their massive guns fast enough to catch the frantic carousel of the maneuverable machine. The rotation speed of the German turrets had fatally lagged behind the speed of the Soviet dash. The captain picked up a heavy, melted shard of an enemy shell from the ground. The metal burned his fingers painfully through his glove. The officer stared at the blackened ruins of the armored wedge for a long time. This wasn't a divine miracle. It wasn't soldier's luck. This was the highest level of combat kinetics, an absolutely cold, machine-like calculation of trajectories and acceleration. Ancient, instinctive step guile multiplied by diesel power and a thirst for life. The captain opened his fingers. The shard of Krupp steel fell into the mud. The officer turned sharply to the stunned major. The captain's gaze was no longer skeptical. In it was an unconditional understanding. "Call in the recovery vehicles, Major," the officer said harshly. "Collect the documents from the dead, and pull this crew off the front line immediately." The major blinked in surprise.
"Send them to the rear, Major," the captain cut him off. "They aren't going before a tribunal. They're going to a training battalion. Let them hammer the science of survival into the replacements, before we all burn to ash out here." The order hit like a backhand blow, ruthlessly canceling any hope of long-awaited sleep. No hospitals, no commendations. The crew didn't even get 24 hours of rest. The front was devouring men at a monstrous rate, demanding more and more machines, while replacements were burning up en masse in their very first fire contact. The training range in the near rear met them with the deafening, incessant roar of worn-out diesels. Heavy, sticky mud flew in thick clumps from under wide tracks, caking over vision slits. The smell of burnt diesel mixed with the stench of scorched clutches had soaked into the explosion-plowed earth. The new crews arrived pale and terrified, stuffed to the gills with field manuals and instructions. They were sick with fear of the heavy German tanks. They expected the surviving veterans to tell them stories of high ideals and heroic deeds. Instead, they were plunged straight into a personal, grueling hell. Sarek yanked a young, trembling cadet out of the formation with a violent jerk on the collar of his greasy tunic. He silently threw him into the driver's seat, into the scorching steel womb of a training T-34 85. The veteran stood behind him, his filthy hands death-gripping the back of the seat. The 12-cylinder engine wailed in agony from a crude, unskilled stomp on the heavy pedal. The training machine lurched, its unsynchronized gearbox grinding hideously, and charged toward the obstacle course. The range was a chaotic, lethal jumble of deep craters, concrete anti-tank teeth, and the charred skeletons of burnt armor. "Floor it!" Sarek rasped into the intercom. The cadet instinctively tucked his head into his shoulders. Directly ahead, the rusted turret of a knocked-out heavy tank loomed inevitably. The animal instinct of self-preservation made the kid throttle back. His muscles cramped. His foot reflexively reached for the stiff main brake pedal. Sarek's heavy fist descended onto the cadet's leather tanker helmet with a brutal swing. The blow rang through the young driver's skull, making him see stars. "Left lever back! Rip it before they kill you!" The veteran's roar drowned out the engine's thunder. In a blind panic, the cadet yanked the left steering clutch. 32 tons of Soviet steel veered sharply, passing within mere millimeters of the obstacle's rusted armor. The screech of metal on metal sent up a shower of blinding white sparks. The multi-ton tank nearly threw its tracks, tilting at a critical angle. The road wheels lifted off the ground. "Brake! Short stop! Exactly 3 seconds!" Sarek bellowed, not giving the kid a single moment to recover. The machine's nose dipped sharply.
A heavy fountain of mud doused the sloped glacis plate. 3 long seconds. That was exactly how long it took an experienced gunner to catch the gray silhouette of an enemy in the crosshairs of a telescopic sight and stomp on the firing pedal. Not a heartbeat longer. Any delay meant guaranteed death from a return armor-piercing shell. "Get moving! They'll cut you down!" Another ruthless blow to the helmet. Another sudden burst of speed. Another dash into a blind spot. Sarek was ruthlessly, methodically beating the manual-prescribed nonsense out of them. He was cauterizing their sticky fear of Krupp steel with an even more potent primal terror of his heavy fist and the unrelenting roar of the overheated diesel. The training turned into a continuous, grueling physical meat grinder on the verge of blackout. Sleep was cut to a miserable 3 hours a day. Crews rotated without stopping. Men collapsed from total exhaustion onto the damp earth right by the mud-spattered treads, vomiting from constant motion sickness and acrid powder gases, only to crawl back into the scorching steel boxes of their machines. Gunners rubbed their faces into a bloody mess against the hard rubber eye guards of the sights. Sarek forced them to track plywood targets blind, orienting themselves only by the short, jagged lunges of the multi-ton machine. Loaders threw 16-kilogram training slugs until their arms locked in dead, insurmountable cramps. The clanging of heavy steel wedge-type breeches merged into a single, monotonous, maddening hum. Stop. Impact. Violent ejection of the spent casing. Accelerate. A dash into thick undergrowth. If a gunner hesitated for even a second, Sarek would strike the mechanic's shoulder, forcing him to lurch the tank forward immediately. The training shell would go uselessly wide. The crew would get a new extra duty cleaning the scorching gun barrel and a sleepless night. No mercy, according to the regulations. No leniency. Survival in maneuverable tank combat absolutely forbade sentimentality. Heroism here was forged exclusively through ruptured calluses, heavy salt sweat, and black hematomas on the shoulders. Suddenly, the training machine's engines sputtered and died right in front of a simulated enemy position. The young driver panicked, frantically jerking the stiff levers in a completely chaotic sequence. The tank's intercom filled with his ragged, animal gasping. Sarek lunged over the seat, his hand clamped onto the boy's thin neck in a steel, merciless grip, squeezing the carotid arteries hard. "Start it!" the step-dweller said, his voice so quiet it made the blood run cold. "Start it, or you'll burn alive right here. The enemy is there. He's already zeroed in. You have exactly 2 seconds before the hit." The fear of imminent death, instilled by the veteran's level, icy voice, proved stronger than the paralyzing panic. With a desperate scream, the cadet jammed the stiff pedal down. His left hand yanked the manual primer, hard clutch. The diesel gave a strained cough, spat out a pillar of black smoke, and roared deafeningly. The machine lunged forward, a split second before the simulated point-blank shot. Sarek let go of the boy's neck. In that brief moment, another cold-blooded professional was born in the cabin. Weeks blurred into one endless, filthy, and unbearably loud conveyor belt. The routine of survival turned out to be far more terrifying than combat itself. It wore out their sinews, physically grinding men into dust, turning them into flawless biological components of heavy levers and precision sights. Young faces turned black from ingrained soot and chronic sleep deprivation. Their eyes took on that cold, completely glazed expression that always distinguished those who had grown used to seeing death in the crosshairs of their optics. They learned not to think. They learned to react solely on the level of unconditional reflexes. See a flash, immediately rip the steering clutch back. Hear the breech clank, drop the clutch. Change position,
Hit them right under the turret. The brutal rhythm of the maneuver was hardwired into their spinal cords, forever replacing the instinct of self-preservation with aggressive, non-stop kinetics. The result of this merciless psychological breaking came in the form of dry staff reports. The casualty curve in the replacement tank battalions plummeted. Statistics, dispassionate and mathematically cold, recorded the absolutely impossible. The greenhorns stopped burning up en masse in their very first head-on clashes. They no longer froze in open, exposed areas. They stopped presenting their thin flanks to long enemy barrels. Soviet machines began to confidently dance their deadly slalom on the front lines, dodging heavy armor-piercing slugs and delivering stinging, dagger-like blows to the heavyweights' vulnerable zones.
Sarek stood silently at the edge of the range, mechanically wiping his grease-blackened hands with a piece of filthy rag. Another T-34 roared past him with a deafening, furious howl. The machine braked hard, its nose dipping deep into the loam. The gun barked dully. A plywood target with a cross silhouette instantly shattered into splinters from a direct hit. The tank lunged forward immediately, deftly vanishing behind a high earthen rampart without waiting for the dust to settle. Not a single wasted second of delay. A perfect, jagged rhythm. The feat had turned into hard, routine work, calibrated to the millimeter. Spring, 1945. The enemy capital had turned into a solid, concrete trap, bristling with gun barrels. Narrow Berlin streets were choked with broken brick, collapsed ceilings, and twisted metal. At every key intersection, heavy armored machines sat in ambush, dug into the ground up to their turrets. From the dark voids of deep basements and attic windows, the black tubes of Panzerfausts stared at the backs of the advancing troops. Moving straight down these avenues according to the manual meant the instantaneous incineration of entire tank columns. Urban combat dictated its own brutal, bloody terms. But the Soviet tank armies were no longer the blind, lumbering targets they had been at the start of the war. They brought a completely different rhythm to the streets of the ruined city. Through a thick, impenetrable veil of cement dust and acrid powder smoke, a T-34-85 medium tank burst forth with a deafening, strained roar. Its wide tracks crushed the old cobblestones with a foul screech, throwing up showers of white sparks. The machine didn't follow a predictable, straight path. It moved in extremely aggressive, jagged lunges, darting from one pile of construction rubble to another. Behind the stiff steel control levers sat a very young man, but his hands worked with the absolutely cold, machine-like precision of a veteran. Hardwired into his muscle memory, into the very core of his brain, were the brutal lessons of the rear area training grounds, endured at the limit of human physical capacity. He no longer thought about the mechanics of the maneuver. He breathed it. Ahead, through the gray shroud of settling dust, a massive, angular silhouette suddenly emerged. A gargantuan, heavy panther sat in a dead ambush behind a formidable barricade of overturned tram cars. Its long 75mm barrel was already locked onto the only narrow passage down the street. "Target front! Armor piercing!" the commander rasped, squeezing the intercom key so hard his knuckles turned white. "Locked on!" the gunner barked. He pressed his bruised, bleeding brow hard against the rubber eye guard of the telescopic sight. The German gunner stomped on the firing pedal first. The heavy, armor-piercing shell tore through the thickened air with a terrifying, ear-splitting whistle. But the Soviet machine was no longer there. A fraction of a second before the blinding flash of the shot, the driver had instinctively yanked the left steering clutch all the way back and slammed his heavy boot onto the main brake pedal with all his might. 32 tons of Soviet alloy steel went into a monstrous skid, tearing up the pavement, and was thrown to the side,
The multi-ton machine smashed through the load-bearing brick wall of a corner building with a crushing kinetic impact. The enemy's armor-piercing slug uselessly detonated a pile of broken stone behind their rear. The tank roared into the dim first floor of the wrecked building. Heavy chunks of molding and thick clouds of white gypsum dust collapsed from the ceiling. The air in the cramped fighting compartment instantly became thick and suffocating, clogging throats with dry grit. The 12-cylinder diesel engine wailed agonizingly in the enclosed stone trap, its echo bouncing off the walls with magnified force. "Panzerfaust! Above!" the loader screamed at the top of his lungs. He spotted a gray uniform in a gaping hole in the concrete ceiling and a steel grenade launcher tube aimed directly at their scorching engine deck. The threat of imminent death from above left no time for a slow turret traverse. The driver slammed the stiff clutch, shifted gears with a lightning-fast crunch, and floored the fuel pedal with animal strength. The diesel choked on fuel, spat a thick cloud of black smoke, and roared. The tank lunged forward with a spin of its tracks, smashing through the remains of the building's interior partitions. The shaped charge grenade hit the stone rubble exactly where the tank's rear had been a split second before. The directional blast burned a massive crater into the floor, dousing the armor plates in a dense hail of molten shrapnel and concrete. The Soviet tank burst through a wide storefront on the opposite side of the building, leaving a thick trail of dust and shattered glass in its wake. This deadly slalom continued without a single pause. The T-34 emerged right on the flank of the German barricade. The heavy Panther was completely blind from this angle. Its electric drives wailed desperately on a high note, trying to traverse the boxy turret toward the sudden new threat. Slowly. Too slowly. The rotation speed of the massive German mechanisms physically could not compete with the frantic, jagged kinetics of the Soviet dash. "Short stop!" the tank commander barked. The driver slammed the brakes with both feet. The tank's nose dipped sharply, its steel track grousers screeching as they bit into the broken asphalt. The emergency stop lasted exactly 3 seconds, not a heartbeat longer. That was exactly what the gunner needed for one calibrated strike into the vulnerable zone. "Fire!" 85 millimeters of pure fury struck point blank.
The armor-piercing shell punched through the thin vertical side armor of the German heavyweight with a sickening, dull crunch of breaking metal. The monstrous internal explosion of the detonating ammunition rack tore the Panther apart from the inside. The massive turret was blown off its ring with a crash and slammed heavily onto the mangled tram tracks. Flames leaped high over the city ruins, illuminating the soot-stained walls. The Soviet tank didn't linger for a single extra moment to assess the results of its fatal hit. Hard clutch, full throttle, right lever back. The machine tore away with a guttural roar and vanished without a trace into the gray dust of the next alleyway before the settling, burning wreckage of the enemy even touched the cobblestones. Across all of burning Berlin, the same scene was unfolding continuously. New, young crews were tearing into the city's deep defenses like steel wolves. They would suddenly lunge from behind heaps of ruins, deliver precise, dagger-like strikes from short stops, and instantly change position, vanishing into the smoke. They no longer made suicidal attempts to punch through the enemy's impenetrable frontal armor at open ranges. They tore the distance to shreds, imposed their own aggressive tempo, and methodically dismantled German pockets of resistance from the vulnerable flanks. The frontline experience of steppe ambushes and the constant, unpredictable, jagged rhythm had become the basic, undeniable instinct of an entire tank army.
In the cramped, unbearably hot cabins reeking of soot, spilled blood, and diesel, sat men whose hands were covered in black, calloused scars from the stiff steel levers. Hard-wired into their brains forever was that ancient intuition of the steppe, translated into the language of dry mechanics, diesel fuel, and heavy armor-piercing shells. The wisdom of survival that the grim veteran had hammered into them at the shell-casing-strewn training range.
Don't break the enemy with brute force head-on if he's heavier. Use the terrain to the maximum. Hide in the blind spots. Turn constant, jagged movement into your primary and most lethal weapon. Lunge, short stop, devastating blow, immediate withdrawal, change position. In this total war of heavy engines and Krupp steel, it wasn't the millimeter thickness of the metal that ultimately survived. Any armor, no matter how thick, would sooner or later be pierced by a heavier kinetic round. What survived were tendons torn to blood, animal reflexes, and the absolute, truly cold concentration of a man who had completely merged with his war machine. The human mind, encased in maneuverable Soviet steel, was methodically, ruthlessly, and decisively defeating dead, lumbering iron. In the air of the ruined spring city, vibrating from continuous artillery blasts, only one all-consuming feeling pulsed: a primal, unstoppable sense of speed. The speed that breaks the enemy's back.